now we're ready to do the gouache stage. So you may recall that gouache is opaque watercolor. So I'm going to set up my palette like a color wheel with my gouache colors. I have my yellow ochre, which is my yellow primary. I have my Prussian blue, which is my blue primary, and my burnt sienna, which is my red primary. So I've set it up into a triangle, and what I can do is I can kind of intermix the colors as I need them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some color into the ink and turn my value study into something that has a little bit more color. Now, because I'm using this soft muted primary set, the colors that I apply are going to be relatively soft and muted up here. And then you're probably asking yourself, well, what about that picture, all those crazy colors? That we're going to use the bright color when we come in with the pastel afterwards. So the gouache can be thinned down, just like watercolor, turn it into washes, or you can use it in a more opaque, thicker manner. But we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we always add enough water so that we're maintaining that tooth. If I close my eyes and I feel this board, I can't feel the ink on there. And we want the same thing to be true of the gouache stage. We don't want any physical buildup of paint, because what that's going to do is going to diminish the tooth, and we can't get pastel to stick to it as well. One of the reasons we're using gouache is that it dries with a matte finish that's slightly toothy. So it is a good medium to use under pastel, but we don't want to lose any of this great tooth on the ampersand board here, the pastel board. So I'm going to have paper towels handy because I might get some dripping, and I'm going to do this stage quickly. I'm not going to stress too much about it, but I'm going to look at colors. I'm going to use mostly true color, so I'm going to kind of mimic the colors that we see here. And sometimes I use the true color, sometimes I use complementary colors, but in this painting we're going to use the true colors. We're going to stick to the colors that we see. So I'm going to look at here, I see some of these greens, and they're dark. And what I like to do before I get to the pastel is I tend to go pretty dark. This is a night painting, and even with a day painting I would go pretty dark, because I know I want to bring that light color in later on. So I'm going to look at these flashes of green here. And one of the things you'll notice is that when I look at a color on this white surface here, on my palette paper, it looks very different when it gets up to the board here. It looks quite a bit lighter because we have a dark surface. So I'm using a blue-green, and here. And this gives us a chance to get some color down on the board. So we're using this mixed media process here without using up too much tooth, and we'll still have plenty of access to that surface when it comes to the pastel. So comes some warm, kind of yellowish tones in here. I've got some reds and oranges all through this middle section. So I'm going to use a combination of the burnt sienna and the yellow ochre, and I'll kind of mix it up a little bit each time so that I get maybe a different kind of amount. So that was a little more yellow than I was expecting, so I'll just get a little bit more of the burnt sienna. So even though these feel like quite neutral colors here, you can see they pop quite a bit off the gray and the blackish colors that we put in. So my lightest of these primaries is the yellow ochre. I'm going to use that in this bright marquee shape over here. I'm not being super specific. I'm keeping it pretty loose. But I'm using enough water that it's a kind of a wash consistency, and it's not going to build up a physical layer on the surface of the painting. So I have a row of kind of reddish tones. I'm going to use my burnt sienna for that. There's a pretty cool cast of blue all through this area, kind of blue and violet. I know that if I make my violet mixture with these, it's going to be pretty dull. So I'm going to stick mostly with my blue here. The burnt sienna has enough yellow in it that it makes purples pretty dull. So that's not going to work for me for this painting. A little bit of light down here, that weird eerie green light. That might be fun to put some of that in. So I'm going to focus on some of the lighter areas now. And I'm looking at this blast of light up here. A little bit on the sign. And it doesn't have to be as light as it's going to become, because I have all that ability to do light colors with a pastel. But this will help me just move away from that lightest light which I had before, which is the gray board, which is a middle gray. So this pops it up a little bit more. And I'm going to put in some, my blue is quite dark, but it will sit well on the ink and just give it some color so it's not just black in my dark darks. So this is, normally I find that the gouache stage on a painting like this is the fastest stage. It goes pretty quick. And I try to be loose and have fun with it, not stress about it too much. And you can start to see that the scene is starting to come alive a little bit, which is really fun. And now this is night sky here, but what if we put a little bit of this Prussian blue into that black? Some more definition on these buildings over here. And a little bit of dark on the figures. And I have some drips, but actually I kind of like them, so I'm not going to worry about them too much. Now, you're probably wondering, why are we using gouache? And when this is a pastel painting. Some of these loose, fluid marks may show through, and it could add a little bit of spontaneity, a little bit of life. Also, we talked about this being a fairly neutralized set of colors, of primaries, and these are pretty soft colors, so the hot, bright, crazy colors will kind of float nicely on top of these colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this dry, and when it's good and dry, we can come in with the pastel layer and really build up those fun colors.